What about the contemporary situation? Present-day dialogue between the three Abrahamic faiths. Well, I mentioned earlier that since 1948, serious conversations between Muslims and Jews have been stalled until there is a final just resolution of the still lamentable situation in the Holy Land. Although there are contexts where there is dialogue between Muslims and Jews, and I myself have participated in them. For instance, in Oxford, we meet twice a year at the house of the Bishop of Oxford. He presides, and there are rabbis there, Muslims such as myself, Christian theologians. And one of the most consistent things to come out of these encounters, which go on all day, is that the Muslims and the Jews almost always agree with each other on theological questions. And there are one or two things that we can't agree on, but generally there's a remarkable consensus. And it's the Christians, because of the Trinitarian view of God, that seem to be out on a limb. So I mentioned this to show that there can be and there should be serious conviviality and discussion between Muslims and Jews, but it's not as frequent as it ought to be. Christian thinkers nowadays have in large part outgrown the medieval polemic. In the mid-19th century, the great sort of quasi-Christian Victorian philosopher Carlyle gave a speech in London attended by people like Mrs. Gaskell and John Stuart Mill and the intellectual establishment. And he gave the speech on the subject of the prophet as hero. And he showed the Prophet Muhammad as a heroic figure, as an alternative model of human perfection. Although he had some criticisms to make of the Quran, nonetheless, since Carlyle's time, it has not been intellectually respectable in the West really to demonize the founder of Islam, as traditionally was the case. Even in the 20th century, you find some Christian theologians of a reactionary bent, including perhaps the best known of all, Karl Barth. Harking back to the old days, Barth, for instance, once famously remarked that the God of Muhammad is an idol like all other idols. Nonetheless, this is being left behind, and palpably there has been a revolution. But the key question in dialogue is always the status of the Prophet Muhammad. The Old Testament prophets, Muslims and Christians can largely agree about them. Jesus, well, there are some areas of overlap and some areas of legitimate argument. But what about the Prophet Muhammad? And a major question that's being asked among Christians is it possible to fit Muhammad into the divine pattern of salvation without dislodging the centrality of the Christ event, of the crucifixion? How can that work? Some Christian theologians have very bravely stated that yes, indeed, Muhammad was a prophet. One of the best known of these is the Edinburgh historian William Montgomery Watt, who has a 2-volume biography of the prophet. He says, for instance, in 1991, there are grounds for holding that God was behind the appearance of Islam in order to bring something better to the people. In other words, Islam came into being not through human planning, but by a divine initiative. Particularly significant for Montgomery Watt because he remains a committed Christian. He's actually an ordained minister in the Church of Scotland. So this now seems to be possible, although there's been quite a lot of criticism from more conservative figures saying that if you accept Muhammad as a prophet, then surely you have to accept in some way the entailment of what he taught. How can you say he was genuinely inspired by God and then not follow what he taught and was doing? Watt gets around this by saying that the Quran is only partly from God. Some of it comes from the divine, some of it comes from the prophet's own mind. So he compares the prophet to Hosea, the Old Testament prophet whose own experiences of his private life come into his contribution to the Bible. Watt goes on to make the very reasonable point that one of the most useful ways of judging the founder of a religion is the gospel principle of by their fruits you shall know them. And he says, if we apply this principle, then the Christian appreciation of the prophet has to be a positive one. Islam has historically inspired great sacred literature, superb, uplifting works of architecture, and allowed many men and women to achieve what has to be recognized as sainthood. So Montgomery Watt is to be admired for all of this, and he's representative of a certain strand of liberal Protestant theology that is concerned to maintain the idea of the generosity and the justice of God. In previous generations, it was possible for Christian thinkers to say because the Muslims are such a demonic bunch of fornicators and devil worshippers and so forth, they're going to go to hell. But nowadays Western theologians are recognizing that there is much of moral and spiritual value in Islam. Hence, the idea that those people are all going to go to hell and that they are following the Antichrist is no longer sustainable. So it's more or less an inevitable product of improved information. On the Catholic side, things have been more cautious but more systematic, as perhaps one would expect. One of the entailments of the Second Vatican Council was a radical revision of the traditional exclusiveness taught by the Catholic Church. Extra ecclesia nulla salus, outside the Church, no salvation. This is no longer accepted. And a papal encyclical called Nostra Aetate, which came in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, said explicitly that Muslims, like Christians, can hope for salvation. Very major revolution, which, given the hierarchical nature of the Vatican, has managed to trickle down to parish level. What about the Muslim side? Well, in a sense, Islam has less to amend here, because the traditional polemic against Christianity in Islam was less sharp than the Christian polemic against Islam. Islam has not reciprocated Christianity's attacks on its founder. It can't, because Jesus is so highly esteemed in the Quran. Islam has been less historically inclined to persecute other faiths. So medieval Muslim cities like Cairo or Damascus or Cordoba were full not just of Muslims but also flourishing Christian communities and Jewish communities. Whereas in medieval Christian cities it was pretty difficult to exist safely as a Jew. To exist as a Muslim or anything else was formally impossible. We find, for instance, that when the first Ottoman embassy came to Britain in the rule of Henry VIII, they were forced to submit to baptism before they were allowed ashore at Portsmouth. It was just inconceivable that there could be any Muslims in England. There's another point here, which is that historically Christianity has wished to dissociate itself from earthly politics. Islam famously involves itself in earthly politics. What are the implications of this for dialogue? Can there be a common ground? There are a number of Muslim thinkers, most recently somebody called Shabir Akhtar, who's a British Asian Muslim, who have proposed, perhaps ironically or whimsically, that the Muslim conquests of the Christian world were actually a blessing for Christianity. Why does he say this? Well, he said in the Byzantine Empire, the various Christian minorities were always fighting each other and being persecuted by the state. As soon as the Muslims arrived on the scene, that persecution ended, so they should have welcomed the thing, and that the most appropriate rulers for traditional Christians are in fact Muslims. And it's true that we find that the monasteries immediately are no longer centres of political intrigue, as they had been under the Byzantines, and could get on with their more important purpose of nurturing human souls in imitation of Christ. Good example of this, perhaps the most visually spectacular manifestation of Christian monastic piety is Mount Athos, which is a promontory off the north coast of Greece. And this superb summit of Eastern Christian spirituality, which produced such spiritual movements within orthodoxy as the Hesychast movement, has about 20 monasteries, still very much flourishing. Under Byzantine rule, the abbots were constantly complaining that they were being drawn into factional infighting in the various imperial disputes in Constantinople, different monasteries supporting different contenders for the throne. In the 14th century it was ravaged. Many of the monasteries were actually burnt by Catalan mercenaries who'd been brought in by one of the claimants to the throne. When the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, arrived in 1420 and captured the Holy Mountain, immediately it found peace, and it became the non-political backwater it had always tried to be. New monasteries were constructed under Muslim rule. The art of icon painting was resuscitated. Sultan Selim I, in fact, generously re-endowed one of the monasteries, and if you go to the monastery of St. Panteleimon today in Mount Athos, you'll see the interesting spectacle of Greek monks actually offering up prayers for the soul of Sultan Selim for having done this. So for 5 centuries of Muslim rule, the Holy Mountain lived in peace until 1912, when the Greek army finally overrun it and the Ottomans left. And just to close off this discussion of the traditional position of Christians under Muslim rule, I've got a quote which is not sufficiently widely known, which comes from the last Turkish governor of Mount Athos. He was sitting in his little konak, his little governor's house on the mountain. Not a very popular position for the Ottoman bureaucracy, because no women allowed on Mount Athos. Not even female animals are allowed there. That's been the rule ever since the Virgin Mary went there, supposedly in the 1st century. So he had to sit there and just rule. And we have this account from a French journalist who was there interviewing him, and he was sitting there puffing on his Turkish pipe, waiting serenely for the Greek police to come along and arrest him. He gave a very interesting interview, and I've translated a little bit of it, which perhaps somebody could read. Do you want to have a go? Okay. This is what he said to the journalist.
Look around you. Look at these thousands of monks. Visit their monasteries. Question them yourself. Of what, in reality, can they complain? Have we touched their rules? Have we violated their property? Have we forbidden their pilgrimages? Have we altered even a little of their secular constitution? What race, I ask you, what conqueror could have treated these people with greater humanity, greater moderation, greater religious tolerance? Under our law, they have remained no less free, indeed freer, than under the Byzantine emperors. And they have not had to endure under our domination 100th part of the devastations you have imposed on your monks in France. Ayden, monsieur, we will regret our passing. Greeks, Russians, Serbs, Romanians, Bulgars, all these monks eat each other like poison. They are bound together only by their common loathing of Islam. When we are no longer there, they will tear each other to pieces.
So that was the Muslim perception of their role, particularly in the Balkans. These Christians would be at each other's throats if it weren't for the generous, tolerant Muslims holding the show together, rather as the British perceived their role to be in India. Incidentally, I should correct what I said earlier. One woman is known to have visited Mount Athos in the past 2,000 years. She was an enterprising French journalist who went there in the 1880s, and in order to carry off her disguise as a man successfully, she had her breasts surgically removed before she went. And she wrote an account of the Holy Mountain, which is in the libraries you can look at if you like. But the rule today is still no women.